Hello, my name is Mark Perry, and today I will be discussing example 2.2, which is a Chopin Etude, Opus 10, number 3, from the Cadwalder and Gagne's reading. I will be discussing how this example 2.2 articulates or demonstrates the several different points from the highlighted in the introduction to this assignment, specifically talking about melodic fluency, gap fill, structural levels, primary tones, decorative tones, showing these in this example, and then discussing how compound melody might not be a part of this example as well. So first, melodic fluency. Melodic fluency, described in the reading as a lot of consecutive stepwise motion, which creates a sense of balance and continuity. However, if a melody is entirely stepwise motion, it can sound dull and boring. And so occasional leaps helps add interest and intrigue to a melodic line. This example contains a lot of stepwise motion. When looking at the first full measure, we see an E and a neighboring motion downwards to a D sharp, back up to E, and then stepwise up to F sharp, then carrying over into the second full measure, more stepwise motion with a neighbor tone of G sharp, stepping down to F, stepping up to G sharp, and then in the third measure, stepping up to A, and then back down to G sharp, at which point we get our first non-stepwise motion from the G sharp in measure 3 up to the C sharp. Now, Schenker would describe this melodic fluency as something that helps add balance to a passage or add balance to a melody. And we see that in this Chopin etude, a sense of balance is maintained because this first leap in measure 3 from that G sharp up to the C sharp is then kind of counterweighted with a leap of a descending fourth from a G sharp down to a D sharp. That is in the fourth full measure. So even though Chopin strays from a purely stepwise motion, the sense of balance is maintained with these two leaps in opposite directions. In fact, the authors of this book talk about how Chopin kind of sets up a pattern with his stepwise motion. Chopin does that, going in from the first full measure, the F sharp, carrying over into the second measure, up to the G sharp neighbor tone, back down to F sharp, and then up to a longer G sharp. It creates a sense of a neighboring motion up and then sustaining that upper neighbor, which then in measure 3, we have another upper neighbor, A, back down to G sharp, and you would expect the G to go up and sustain another A, but it doesn't. Instead, it leaps up to the C sharp, which is just subverting expectations of how you'd expect the melody to progress. This leads into the next bit of the next category of gap fill. While in the pickup into the first measure, there is a leap from the fifth scale degree up to the tonic. While there is the law of recovery, it leaps up the fourth and then is stepwise motion down to the D sharp. If that line continued to descend, it would be considered the gap fill, where you create a gap with a leap and then fill it in with stepwise motion in the opposite direction. In that case, it doesn't happen. However, the other two leaps in the melody do demonstrate this gap fill. So we see that in the third measure, when the G sharp leaps up to the C sharp, the notes following the C sharp are as follows: B down to A, down to G sharp, where the leap started. And then once it gets down to the G sharp, it instantly leaps down to the D sharp, creating this gap, which is then filled with stepwise motion ascending. So we got in the fourth measure, G sharp down to D sharp, then we see E, then we see F sharp, and then back up to G sharp, so we have leap up, step down, leap down, step up, which leads us into the final, for what is shown here, the little cadence of this section, G sharp down to F sharp, passing all the way back down to our tonic E. So we see this gap fill technique as well. Now, the next bit is talking about structural levels. Structural levels, to the best of my understanding, is where you can think about the melody in several different capacities. You could think about like the most surface level, as described in this book chapter, is every note in the melody. I guess maybe thinking of each note with somewhat equal importance. It's the melody after all. Why would you think of it in any other way? However, they go on to describe how certain notes, really called primary tones, kind of bleeding into the next section, primary tones are the backbone, are the foundation of what gives the melody good shape. So in the analysis in the book, the authors show how the pickup is a primary tone, a structural thing. It's a B, the chordal fifth of the tonic. And then the first note of the first full measure, E, another primary tone. There, the D sharp back up to E, they're really considering that D bleeding into the next thing is a decorative tone. It's not actually foundational to the melody itself. It's just decorating the melody, making it interesting. This idea of diminution, I think is that correct word. I'm not looking at it right now, but diminution, where instead of just having a boring melody, do, re, mi, re, do, kind of dressing it up so that it goes somewhere, there's shape to it. Do, ti, do, re, fa, mi, has some intrigue to keep the listener engaged. And we see that here with this lower neighbor D sharp. Then we are calling, or the authors are calling, this F sharp the next structural primary tone. More about that in a second. In measure 2, they show G sharp as another primary tone, and then they don't articulate any primary tones in the third full measure. I find this interesting. Based on how they included the F sharp as a passing tone and still calling that a primary tone, it surprises me that they didn't also call the A in measure 3 melodic primary tone as well. Perhaps the duration is shorter and therefore it doesn't have as much of an effect. Perhaps because it doesn't return to the A like we returned to the G in the previous measure, perhaps that weakens it. Or perhaps since F sharp is a chord tone with the underlying 5 chord in measure 1, perhaps since we're not really calling the A a chord tone, even though I feel like it would belong, excuse me, rambling. Perhaps because it's not a chord tone, that's why it's not considered a primary tone to the melody. However, in measure 4, a restatement of G sharp, in that same measure, going back down to F sharp, and then finally returning to E for the last note of the melody. So these primary tones create a framework that are then decorated with the decorative tones, in which there are many. As I've mentioned before, we have in measure 1 a lower neighbor of D sharp, and then in measure 2 there is a lower neighbor of F sharp, if we're now thinking of the G sharp as being the most important thing. There are a couple chordal leaps in throughout, as well as other just decorative motion. I would, returning to structural level, it surprises me that they stopped where they did. I would be tempted to take the structural level one step deeper, rather than including the F sharp as a passing tone between the tonic arpeggiation of B up to E up to G sharp, and then G sharp back down to E. It surprises me that they included F sharp in that as well. I would maybe even consider calling the F sharp just a passing tone between the E and the G sharp, ultimately considering the 5 chord that supports the F sharp, really considering it a chord built on arpeggiation of the tonic. So that is interesting to me. I think it would be reasonable to take it one step further and exclude the F sharp from the primary tone list. Finally, discussing the existence of a compound melody here. I'm tempted to, I do not feel strongly that there is any real evidence of a compound or polyphonic melody here. First, there really aren't enough leaps. There doesn't really seem to be 2 different registers being represented, and the passing motion between chord tones really does seem to be, it feels far more connected than disjunct. The only 3 leaps in the melody, as discussed before, is the opening one, which is a scale degree 5 as an upbeat to the tonic, which makes the scale degree 5 sound much more decorative of the tonic rather than its own melody. And for the other leaps, it was already discussed how those leaps are embellishing the melody by subverting expectations, and then those leaps are instantly filled in with this gap fill technique. So there's no sense of a lower phrase followed by a higher phrase that would seem to contain its own melody, and then returning to the lower phrase in some sort of disjunct pattern. It all feels very continuous, which leads me to think of it as one melody rather than 2 or more. Thank you.